Yuval, you said that on the morning of October 7th, you knew immediately who had planned this massacre. How come?
Because I know the person who planned and conceived and initiated this criminal attack. I have known him since 1996, and not only him, but the entire Hamas leadership in Gaza. And it was clear to me that this is what they were planning while they were still in prison, and this is the plan of Hamas. It was very clear to me.
You're talking about Yahya Sinwar, and you said that when you realized what happened on October 7th, you were kind of tormented by what you did for him in jail. You essentially saved his life. Tell me about that story.
In 2004, I saved Sinwar's life in prison. I was the doctor who diagnosed the problem he had. When he explained to me what was happening to him, I diagnosed it as a stroke. And together with the general practitioner, we decided to take him to the hospital. He arrived at the hospital. The diagnosis was that he had abscess in the brain, and he was operated on that day, thus saving his life, because if it had exploded, he would have died. He thanked me and the doctors for saving his life, and he also asked the security officer, who was a Muslim, when we visited him in the hospital, to tell me in Arabic and explain to me what it means for someone to save a Muslim's life, and that he owed me his life. He also told me that on the day he was released in the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, that he owed me his life, and one day he will repay it. And as you understand, he repaid it on October 7th, and that he was also directly responsible for the murder of my nephew in Kibbutz Nir Oz.
Your nephew went to try to save his family and others when the invasion happened and the massacres happened, and he was abducted and apparently killed, or he died of his wounds, being dragged back into Gaza. Do you believe that had Sinwar known it was your nephew, the outcome would have been different?
I did not and do not engage in speculation. My nephew came out to defend the community and the country and the Gaza envelope. He fought in those terrible moments of the morning in Kibbutz Nir Oz.
Can I ask you what you learned about Sinwar and Hamas in jail?
I had many hours, hundreds of hours of conversation with Sinwar, both as a dentist and as an intelligence officer.
What impression did you get of his plans, of his goals?
I learned from him, and I learned from the other leaders. It was clear to me that Sinwar reflects the Hamas-Gaza worldview. Sinwar told me clearly in 2004 that they would be ready to sign a hudna, a truce, for 20 years because the state of Israel is currently a strong state. But he also told me that in 20 years, he estimates that we will be weakened because of internal struggles between us within Israeli society. And as soon as they recognize that we are weak, they will attack us. And they also said clearly that we as Jews have no place on these lands, on the lands on which the state of Israel is located. These are Waqf lands. These are Muslim lands. These are lands that do not belong to us. Therefore, we as Jews have no right to exist on the lands. Therefore, there is no compromise. There is no compromise on the 1967 borders or 1948 borders. It's either us or them. Therefore, it's only a matter of time and timing that they will act against us and try to expel us from the place where we live. This is a worldview that they did not hide. He told me that explicitly. But his way was much more extreme than others. His thought that this conflict can only be resolved by force, and the struggle they are waging against us, that Hamas is waging, is a religious struggle. The war is a religious war. It is not a nationalist war. It is not about establishing a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. It's all Palestine. He only said this more bluntly than other Hamas leaders in the West Bank.
Yuval, now he apparently, according to Israeli intelligence, I think, Sinwar is still somewhere in those tunnels in Gaza, still apparently calling the shots. 9 months, 8 months into this war. When you think about his mental state now and who he is, the person you know, what do you think he's thinking about ceasefire, about anything, about releasing the hostages that still remain?
I've made my opinion very clear for 8 months, and at every stage of this war. I've made my opinion very clear, and until today I have unfortunately not been wrong about my assessments regarding Sinwar. I wish I was mistaken. I was asked in the first few days of the war what Sinwar would demand in exchange for the hostages. It was clear to me that he would release the women and children because of Hamas's interests, and not due to Israel's military pressure, because he was attacked by the entire world, and especially by Qatar, which felt embarrassed. And the moment that he released the women and children and turned the pressure onto Israel, it was clear to me that the goal of this criminal and murderous attack, in which women, children, and innocent civilians were murdered, raped, and burned in their homes, was to release Palestinian prisoners. He stated this in 2011 when he was released during the Shalit deal. He thought the Shalit deal was a bad deal that Hamas should not have accepted. And he said the day he was released that the Shalit deal was a bad deal. We will kidnap soldiers in order to release those we left behind. And the success of the October 7th attacks caused the kidnapping of 240 Israeli civilians, some of whom were also soldiers. And he brought on the IDF's response, which he did not expect, because he did not think he'd managed to kidnap 240 civilians and soldiers. He thought he'd managed to get a number of soldiers, but didn't think the IDF would be left unprepared along the borders. If the main reason of the attack was to release Palestinian prisoners, the IDF's response forced him to change his priorities. And at the moment, since the day the IDF entered the Gaza Strip, his priority is to maintain his rule. He put the issue of releasing the prisoners as a second priority. Now the first priority is to maintain Hamas's rule. The condition for releasing the hostages will only be the IDF's withdrawal from Gaza and the end of the war. The hostages are being used to achieve his goals. Unfortunately, Israel made a mistake during its military operation and in its thinking that only military pressure would bring the release of hostages, which I said in the first month of the war. I thought a military effort was important in order to dismantle Hamas, destroy it, and to hurt its military capabilities. It's an important effort, but in order to return the hostages, it's not enough, because Sinwar thinks only about the continuity of his rule. He is willing to sacrifice even 100,000 Palestinians in order to ensure the survival of his rule. He is willing to pay with the lives of militants, Hamas members, civilians. He doesn't care. And therefore, Israel's mistake is that it did not create an alternative to Hamas's rule, and didn't replace Hamas's rule, and didn't allow an improved version of the Fatah or Palestinian Authority forces to enter in order to make clear to Sinwar that he has lost everything, both his military capability, but mostly his authority in Gaza. That would have caused Sinwar to make a deal to return our hostages in exchange for prisoners. Today, he feels he is in a powerful position. He is running the negotiations while still operating from within Gaza and still controls the areas from which the IDF evacuated. He also controls the humanitarian aid, and therefore he feels strong and won't sign an agreement to release the hostages unless the IDF withdraws from Gaza and the fighting ends.